but we will soldier on here. This afternoon's webinar is What's the Deal with the Green New Deal, a guide for faculty. We are really privileged to have two wonderful presenters, not only because they're great guys, but they're knowledgeable on these issues. This webinar is intended to provide faculty with a better understanding of the context for the Green New Deal resolution introduced in Congress. We'll be presenting an inside the Beltway perspective on its genesis and potential impact. Jeremy Symons will provide an overview of the Green New Deal resolution and the key players. I'll be quick to point out that Jeremy is not one of the drafters or internal to Congress promoters of the Green New Deal. He's just merely an expert who understands all the players and the political dynamics. So he will offer a snapshot of the state of play on the Hill in both the House and the Senate, as well as in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, where there are Green New Deal implications as well. Earlier this year, Jeremy moderated a briefing to congressional staff in Washington, D.C., in which he and I and Alan Horowitz linked the content of the Green New Deal proposal to the broader sustainability policy discussion in the U.S. And in the announcement for this event, you had the link to my op-ed in the Hill newspaper as background for that context. Then, building on Jeremy's remarks, Mark will focus on the identification of resources for faculty on the Green New Deal and sustainability via his Climate Web platform. Mark has been doing an incredible job in doing an inventory and organizing climate change education materials on the web. The Climate Web is the product of over 20,000 hours of crowdsourcing and curating knowledge from thousands of experts to support understanding of and responding to climate change. In short, it's a collective climate change intelligence. From the listings for hundreds of relevant websites, organizations, and resources, and links to online courses, videos, and text modules, Mark will guide us today to these resources most relevant to the Green New Deal without us having to reinvent the pedagogical wheel. He'll show how teachers can actually get desktop access to these resources for much easier and customizable knowledge work and delivery. I'm going to proceed to introduce briefly. You have the full bio for both Jeremy and Mark in the announcement, but for those listening to the recording, that's why I read the announcement and then reintroduce Jeremy and Mark. Jeremy is a writer, strategist, and consultant on the environment and politics. He's the principal of Symons Public Affairs, where he works with clients to deliver high-impact pragmatic solutions to some of the world's most pressing problems. He's a frequent advocate in the media for environmental progress, and he's debated issues across a wide variety of news programming, including the O'Reilly Factor and the NewsHour. Previously, he was vice president of political affairs at Environmental Defense Fund. He also served as deputy staff director for the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works as part of the Senate Democrat leadership team. He also was at National Wildlife Federation, where he was senior vice president for conservation and education. And Jeremy is the holder of a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown, and his bachelor's is from Brown. Mark Trexler has more than 30 years of regulatory and energy policy experience. He's advised clients around the world on climate change risk and management. Mark joined World Resources Institute in 1988, where he worked on the first carbon offset project. He founded Trexler Climate Energy Services in 1991, that should be. He's worked extensively with the electric sector and other energy clients, and with government and NGO clients on risk mitigation and adaptation strategies, decision support tools, carbon market models, and carbon offset quality scoring systems. He directed EcoSecurity's Global Consulting Services Group, and then after EcoSecurities acquired Trexler Climate and Energy Services, he was director of climate risk for Det Norske Veritas from 2009 and to 2012. Finally, Mark holds graduate degrees from the University of California at Berkeley. Illustrious credentials for both. I'm going to let very quickly Mark explain what you're going to see in the background while Jeremy is presenting, and then we will turn it over to Jeremy. So, Mark, would you like to give a bit of detail on what we're all seeing?
Sure, Ira. So what Jeremy and I have done is, in terms of coordinating this, is that he is not going to have a PowerPoint today, and what I'm going to have on screen is actual live screenshots from the Climate Web that Ira introduced briefly. And just to let you know, the Climate Web is a largely open access online system that you can get to at theclimateweb.org. And what is particularly interesting in the context of the Green New Deal, because one of the goals of the Climate Web is to foster a systems-based thinking approach to climate change topics. And so you can just see right here on the screen, this is the Green New Deal index entry, and you can see all of the subsidiary index entries, all of which are very relevant to the questions that we're talking about with the Green New Deal. And so as Jeremy talks, what I'm going to try to do, and we haven't coordinated this or practiced this, so it'll be a little bit ad hoc, but try to sort of show you different parts of the Climate Web that are relevant to the topic of Jeremy's conversation. And then I'll sort of come back after Jeremy's thing and do a little more wrap up and discussion of this knowledge management system and how it can really help foster coming up learning curves on these issues a lot more rapidly than is normally possible. So let me leave it there and turn it over to Jeremy.
Jeremy, before you get started, let me just again annoyingly remind everyone to please mute their phone lines. And again, even more annoyingly, apologize to everyone for the failings of the GoToMeeting system today. It seems to be affecting everyone's ability to plug in via computer audio and causing all of us to dial in by phone, including me and Jeremy and Mark, so we're all in the same less than optimal boat. Jeremy, I would like to turn it over to you for some preliminary remarks to give this principally faculty audience a feel for what's going on the Hill with the Green New Deal, from whence it came, the genesis of the proposal, and then perhaps how we've taken it forward through our congressional briefing in June, and then we will open it up to questions from both me and the audience for Jeremy. Obviously, my admonition about muting lines is falling on some deaf ears, but we will move forward anyway. Go ahead, Jeremy. Thank you. Jeremy, can you hear?
Jeremy, are you on mute?
Okay, well, we can still hear Mark. So I think what we're going to have to do is, Mark, why don't we go to your presentation first, and hopefully Jeremy will dial back in and we'll just flip-flop the order, if that's okay with you, Mark.
Sure. And if when Jeremy comes back in, we'll just turn it back over to him. And so Jeremy, if you hear me, just speak up. So what we decided to do was that I would not focus sort of on the substance of the Green New Deal, but focus more on how to help people explore the Green New Deal, and students in particular, in terms of how can you find resources and how can you sort of get past, ideally, the Green New Deal 101 conversation, which is where so much of the conversation is. And yet it's actually a very complicated topic with a long history and with all sorts of barriers, all sorts of all sorts of issues. Okay, Jeremy.
Hey, Mark, should I jump in?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I was not on mute, but you guys couldn't hear me. So if you all can go on mute again, that would be great. I'm getting some feedback, including you, Ira. Great. Thanks, guys. Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. Glad to be here, calling in from the DC suburbs, where we're still a little bit surprised to be celebrating, and more than a little bit thrilled to be celebrating the Washington Nationals World Series victory. But we're here to talk about climate and the Green New Deal. So let me jump in. I was thinking, talking with Ira and Mark, to hit on four big, broad topics. One, starting really with what the Green New Deal resolution specifically is, because that is, given, regardless of the genesis, that is the actual body of work that's moving forward in Congress right now. Two, taking a look at what really is and isn't in there, with a specific eye on some myths about the Green New Deal. Third, an assessment of the context and politics, the context of the Green New Deal and the politics of climate change and how it fits in. And finally, where to from here, and where the Green New Deal is going, and some of the work that Ira and I and others have been doing. So starting with the resolution. So there's a short, in congressional world, short, about 14-page resolution. It's House Resolution 109, also Senate Resolution 59, and it recognizes the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal. It is a sense of Congress. It is not actionable. It is not legislation that requires the federal government to do anything. It lays out essentially the platform of the Green New Deal. Of course, as you know, it was introduced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and in the Senate, Senator Ed Markey worked on the Waxman-Markey legislation a decade ago. He is the chief sponsor. There's 95 co-sponsors in the House. They're all Democrats. There's 14 in the Senate, of course, all Democrats is there as well. So what does it do? So the resolution lays out that there's basically, it's the duty of the federal government to create a 10-year Green New Deal mobilization, and there's really 5 parts to it. One is achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions through fair and just transition for all communities and workers. Net zero in climate change, it's not defined in the resolution. I tend to think, and so there's always a danger of trying to define it, but I look at it pretty simply, which is like right now the United States is emitting about 7 times as much emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, as our forests and soils and other ecosystems are absorbing out of the air. So we have to basically cut emissions 85% or more to get to a place where they're in balance, and our overall net emissions would be 0. So that's number one, net zero. Number two is jobs, creating millions of good, I'm using their language, millions of good high-wage jobs and ensuring prosperity and economic security for all people of the United States. Number three is infrastructure, investing in infrastructure to sustainably meet the challenges of the 21st century. Four, to secure for all people of the United States, one, clean air and water, climate and community resiliency, healthy food, access to nature, and a sustainable environment. And then the fifth piece is promoting justice and equity by stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression of frontline and vulnerable communities, again, using their language. So those are the five anchor pieces. There's a long list of sector-by-sector ambitions to mobilize and cut emissions, 100% clean electricity, climate resiliency, infrastructure, smart grids. All this, of course, in the resolution you can look up. Buildings, manufacturing, sustainable farming, zero emission vehicles, public transport with a big emphasis on high-speed rail, climate impacts mitigation, natural sequestration in soils and forests, and making the U.S. a leader on the global stage, all core components of the actionable side. There are also significant pieces to this on counteracting what the Green New Deal calls systemic, racial, regional, social, environmental, and economic impacts that disproportionately are affecting frontline and vulnerable communities. There's a significant worker and union piece to this resolution, creating create high quality union jobs that pay prevailing wages, guaranteeing a job with a family sustaining wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations, and retirement security to all people of the U.S. Strengthening and protecting the right of all workers to unionize, and strengthening and enforcing labor, wage, and hour standards across employers. And then finally, there's this last section that says, I'll just read it to you, that the purpose of the Green New Deal is also, quote, providing all people of the United States with high quality health care, affordable, safe, and adequate housing, economic security, and clean water, clean air, healthy and affordable food, and access to nature. So it's a very broad platform in resolution form. One piece on the history, it did come to a vote. And let me just make sure, can anyone, Ira, or Mark, can people hear me fine?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, we're good.
Everybody's doing a great job on muting, so with zero feedback, I just wanted to make sure. So on March 26th, Mitch McConnell brought the Green New Deal sorta to the floor of the Senate. He sensed a real political opportunity to drive a wedge amongst Democrats because he knew that there was a lot of discomfort. And amongst the Democratic caucus, who was just coming to terms with this whole Green New Deal thing. It really is only a month or two old. So he took Markey's resolution, he put it in his own bill and brought it to the floor. And it was a gimmick. I mean, he brought it to the floor to vote against it. We knew there was a danger of this. Folks had advised senators that there would be a danger if they did this. The Democrats decided, rather than they recognized that they weren't ready for this fight yet. This was all too new. So they all just simply voted president, with the exception of 3 Democrats and an independent, Angus King from Maine, who tends to vote with the Democrats on environmental issues for sure. The other Democrats were Manchin, Jones, and Sinema. They joined with the Republicans. So in the end, it was a 0-57 vote with 43 Democrats voting present. And it wasn't even a vote on the measure, it was whether there should be a debate on the measure. So McConnell copied it, pasted it, put it in his own bill, brought it to the floor, and then brought it up in the motion to move it forward to action and voted against that. It was pretty cynical. Look, they see a real political opportunity here, obviously, in attacking this as a broad example of Democrats moving too far to the left. And I think they made a big mistake here, because I think there's a very real, and I think the polling's proven it out since, that there's a very real hunger in the country, including amongst independents and some Republicans, voters for action on climate change. And it really exposed the fact, alongside his message, it exposed the fact that Republicans had absolutely nothing to offer, nothing to counter with. That's my personal take on it. It's something I've written on the Hill, thehill.com, where I write my stuff. So that's sort of the history of what's up there. Let me talk a little bit about what this really is and what it isn't, some of the myths and facts. I look at it sort of like an ink blot. It's a Rorschach test. The Green New Deal, when people hear it, means something different to everyone, including different people within the climate movement, especially different people, different political orientations. So what is this? It's a resolution. As I said, it's a sense of Congress. Sense of Congress is used for a couple different reasons. In this case, it's used to be an organizing vehicle to try to get something down on paper and then gain support. They've had a co-sponsorship drive, said in the House they're up to 95, and of the Democratic caucus, a little less than half. But if you get a resolution passed as a sense of Congress, nothing happens. It doesn't actually carry any force of action or law. It just expresses the position of Congress. It's been mischaracterized, I would say, significantly by opponents and supporters alike. The phrase in particular has been co-opted and used by candidates. Bernie Sanders actually calls his entire climate plan the Green New Deal, but it's different than the Green New Deal resolution. There are common themes in how people are using it for sure, but they all have some important nuances and differences, particularly given the scope of the Green New Deal resolution, getting into guaranteed wage and other aspects that more usually when people are talking about Green New Deal on the political front, from politicians, they tend to be talking a little bit more narrowly about climate action, some of the interaction with justice and the economy. One of the reasons there's a lot of confusion is there was as you all know, most likely there was this FAQ that Cortez, that AOC's office put out. Markey, AOC's office ended up pulling it back. Markey wasn't on board with it. It wasn't nearly as thought through as the resolution itself. It certainly created lots of talking points for the GOP. There was stuff in there about whether people whether if we cut all emissions, people could still eat hamburgers or fly. And there was something in there that talked about economic security, quote, for all who are unable or unwilling to work. Again, that's all been pulled back, and those are really distractions from the main thrust of it in the resolution. But there are some more deeper and significant policy things that I think need to be recognized, because the AOC negotiated with Markey to get, and my headset's dying, so I'm going to switch over to my my phone here as I talk. Sorry. So AOC negotiated with Markey, and in particular, that brought in the unions and other parts of the Democratic caucus that he knew would be important. Unions had been involved, of course, in the Green New Deal, but not the broad breadth of unions that are present in Democratic circles on the Hill. So some of the things that activists that started the resolution, which came from seemingly out of nowhere after the election, filling the vacuum when the Democrats took office, the Sunrise Movement is the biggest player in putting that together and leading the grassroots tactics that put it on the stage, AOC being the camera getter that drew the spotlight to it. So they have their agenda, but when it came down to it in the resolution, you won't see mention of things like nuclear power, fracking, even carbon pricing, core issues that, the climate movement is somewhat divided on. And in the case of nuclear power and natural gas, and those have strong support from unions. And so, references to trying to get off nuclear, natural gas explicitly were taken out, even though the overall gist of moving away from fossil fuels to clean energy is still in there. And there's specific references now to zero emission energy, along with clean and renewable energy, which would seem to open the door to nuclear in the resolution. And then on the carbon pricing or cap and trade front, that's less of a union issue, but more about the fact that there's still a lot of policymakers and a lot of interest groups, environmental groups, and others that see those as key tools on climate change. And so shutting down the door on that, would split the climate community as well. So there isn't really talk one way or another about those tools. Neither is included in the plan, nor is it ruled out as some had wanted. One of the biggest issues where there's confusion, I think, is on dates and timetables for getting to net zero emissions. AOC and Sunrise, in their Green New Deal had originally pushed that we should get there by 2030, that the 10-year mobilization should have a deadline of when we get to our emissions goal. There is actually no timeline in the resolution itself. What there is, let me let that sit in. There is no timeline. For all you hear about different, pieces of this, the resolution itself it's not silent on the issue, but it didn't decide the issue. What the resolution has is a 10-year mobilization, and then it talks about a net zero goal. But it doesn't say net zero in 10 years. So in theory, we could be mobilized. In fact, there's a lot of language in there about whenever we can practically get there in this sector or that sector. So there's recognition we're not going to be able to get there universally, practically across all sectors at the same time. But there's a real urgency clearly in there. There is a 2050 timeline mentioned for net zero emissions. That's a global statement of the problem that we need to get globally to net zero by 2050, which doesn't really answer what the U.S. timetable itself should be. All right, so that's it on the on some of that background, the missing facts. In terms of the context of politics of this, how it fits into the broader climate politics up here in Washington. Look, a lot of the policy ideas, they weren't really new. They're not even really that fleshed out. The idea of getting big reductions sector by sector, of mobilizing investment, but boy, they sure pulled it together in a very compelling way, and got enormous amount of support behind it, and jumped into this political stage in a huge way up here that really lifted not just the Green New Deal, but the climate change as an issue overall. One of the challenges that I think continue to try to work to put together policy ideas is the same challenge that everybody else faces in putting together climate policy. It's just really difficult to pair up to sync up the top-down math of what's needed to deal with such an urgent crisis that has that has such a wide scale of emission sources on the one hand, and do the bottom-up policies that can drive change on the other. So figuring out the specifics, the details of how you maximize a true urgency and mobilization in each of these sectors. It's not that it can't be done. It's not that the policy is not there. It's just not really that simple to put it all together and get consensus on it. That said, I think the Green New Deal was a huge deal when it came to expressing big changes happening in the environmental movement right now, and sustainability, climate change, inequity, social justice, climate justice, all these different pieces of movements are movements in themselves, how they're coming together. But particularly, I think this is an expression of the rise of youth, and particularly the importance of climate justice as key movers and components of climate advocacy and the climate movement. Another big thing here is that I think the Green New Deal and IRA has really done a lot on this and written a good piece and talks about this a lot on the Hill. But the fact of the matter is that the Green New Deal really seems to is anchored in all three quadrants of sustainability. The environmental progress that's needed, the social justice progress, the economic progress that are needed to happen hand in hand. That said, it seems somewhat unattached from a lot of the work that's been done out there on sustainability and how, some of the lessons to be learned from other sustainability work from date, and that's something that Ira can speak to and is written about as well. So, but nevertheless, it certainly advanced the notion in a very strong way politically that you need to look at all three core components of sustainability together. Public support for the Green New Deal is strong when it's polled, but really few people actually still know that much about it. If you give them any information about it, you'll get 2/3 to 3/4 support depending on which poll you look at. I don't think that's surprising in any way, simply because policies to reduce pollution and hold polluters accountable to mobilize our economy around clean energy. These have always attracted significant supermajorities of support for as long as the 20+ years I've been working on this. And the problem is that despite the support we've had for climate policies, we haven't seen real action. And that's obviously because we have such enormous vested interests that have worked successfully, in my view, to obstruct the progress on climate change. Whether we're talking about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is lobbying arm of big business, American Petroleum Institute, the oil companies, dedicated lobbying arm, the Kochs, that we have basically an entire climate obstruction lobby that has really vested itself in a strategy of making climate change a toxic issue in the Republican Party. And so that leads to the more visible problems, which are, one, we have incredible deep partisan divides on this. And two, our government was never created to create big change in the face of partisan divides. That's why we have things like the filibuster and other barriers to getting policy done in the event that you have very narrow margins of support politically. So we just don't see the general support for policies translating to support amongst elected officials, particularly in the Republican side, of the equation. So, having public support is important. It's nice, but the real thing that the Green New Deal brought that we haven't seen so far is a real intensity of voter concern, particularly in the Democratic ranks. And this is something that, I think for the first time, in 2018, I first noticed this trend in the elections. I did analysis after the election and saw that the environment had broken through as a top issue for the first time. I've been looking at this, tracking this. And I think the Green New Deal tapped that. I think they did it very well. I think they both tapped it and propelled it at the same time. But there's no question that Democrats today know that their donors, their voters, the people are knocking on doors for them. They care deeply about climate. It's one of their top 3 issues. And that's why the presidential candidates got out ahead of a lot of other folks in signing up to quote unquote Green New Deal policies, is they want to tap that energy and not be on the wrong side of that. And, I think that's a significant change that will increase the chances if Democrats gain power in the coming election that something gets done on climate, although that won't necessarily be easy. Let me just say one thing before moving to where to from here about some of the risks in the climate movement, because I think as educators, I think these are important to recognize. There's clearly a lot of friction within the climate movement, has been for some time, on issues about how you deal with urgency, issues of like, do you try for pragmatic deal making, or do you, demand bold systemic changes? How fast do we transition from fossil fuels? How do we deal with workers that affects? How do we deal with climate justice? Nuclear power, fracking, carbon pricing. There's been actually, one of the things about climate getting back on the radar is that after basically a decade of inaction up here, there's now a sense of momentum, and people are starting to realize that we need to try to bridge some of these. So we have a number of major environmental groups and climate justice leaders put together a just and equitable climate platform, which was the first step to dialogue and bridging some of that. On the labor side, the Blue-Green Alliance, which of unions and environmental groups, which has existed for some time, has put together a really important roadmap that was not, again, easy to arrive at, but it's called Solidarity Platform, but that bridges what the needs of workers and what needs to happen on sustainability and climate and clean energy. So those are a couple of things. I think the leaders of the Green New Deal have actually done a really good job, like the Sunrise Movement, of trying to get people to work together rather than exacerbate, those divisions that they and everyone else has to recognize and deal with in a broad movement. But it's going to be really challenging as things get more and more real if Democrats gain power, for everyone to realize that we can't allow the divisions on issues like this, that we need to overcome them in order to actually get work done rather than let them split us. And because we know that inaction has a lot of, basically, if we don't unite in pushing for action, it's not going to get done. So lastly, and then we'll open up for questions, Ira, where to from here? Look, this reminds me a lot of the work that we were doing in 2007, 2008, before Obama got elected, where we were able to move quickly on climate change, but not quickly enough. We were the third priority in that presidency, and that wasn't enough. But boy, we sure came a long way from 2006 in getting to a top 3 political priority. This feels a lot bigger, has a lot more grassroots support. This time, I think there's a big question is what will happen in the elections, and who will be president. But I think the Green New Deal has really helped elevate this on the radar, particularly of Democrats. And right now you have committees working on the Hill. The House Energy and Commerce Committee is putting together a climate plan. There's a new Climate Crisis Committee in the House that's putting together recommendations to other committees. And there's a Democrat only, unfortunately, but still a Senate Climate Crisis Committee that's been put together. And all of them are trying to fill that vacuum and put policy ideas together of what could happen. I think if there's a new president, their ability to implement the Green New Deal, even if they so chose unilaterally, executive power is limited. I think you'll see a new president on the Democratic side doing a lot of using the tools that President Obama used. Those are really important. But the power of the purse for mobilization, the power of investment, rests with Congress. And I think it's more likely you'll see pieces of that try to move through like infrastructure, which is a priority of Schumer. And Schumer just recently announced the whole transportation climate initiative with a whole Cash for Clunkers incentive program to try to move people from gas engines to electric vehicles. Things like that are probably more likely to move than sort of a standalone Green New Deal resolution or offshoot from that. Let me stop there and talking for a while and open it up. Back to you, Ira and Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jeremy, for that sophisticated snapshot of where the Green New Deal stands on the Hill. I'll throw out the first question to you because it relates to some of the items I posted in the chat box while you were talking, Jeremy, on how some of the campaigns have picked up the Green New Deal. You alluded to the Bernie Sanders version of the Green New Deal, and I can add my own recent experience to share with the faculty on the call here. I went to a Green New Deal workshop at McGill in Montreal last week. And somewhat embarrassingly, rather than talking about the Green New Deal resolution, which is readily available, and I put the link to the full resolution in the chat box. The organizers of that event focused solely on Bernie Sanders' campaign statement. So as Jeremy pointed out, one lesson learned is please let's be careful about what Green New Deal we're talking about, because not only has the Green New Deal resolution been picked up by some of the campaigns, for those more scholarly inclined to go back into the literature, there have been at least 10 other Green New Deal proposals over the past decade in the US and around the world. So it does get a little dicey if we're not clear on exactly what Green New Deal we are talking about. I'm waiting for questions to come in the chat box, and I have sent a number of notes along saying please use the chat box.
Ira, let me
Matt.
Ira?
Hang on. One second. I see that Matt has posted another resource that's available, but let me turn it over to Mark for his thoughts.
Yeah, let me just quickly wrap up a little bit. As you saw in the course of Jeremy's discussion, I was jumping around a little bit in the climate web to show you where some of the different resources are, and hopefully gave you sort of a feel for what's in here. The climate web is a massive system, has 15,000 documents, 35,000 URLs, 200,000 thoughts. It has almost anything anyone would want to know about climate change and solving climate change, but it also gets into, the topic of wicked problems, the whole wicked problem literature, the whole literature around systems thinking for climate change. One of the new terms that you might not have run into yet was just developed a couple of months ago, but that is going to be very applicable to the Green New Deal conversation, is this whole term of green wishing as opposed to green washing. And an awful lot of the stuff that happens with the Green New Deal is probably going to fall into, or certainly a lot of the conversation is going to fall into the green wishing space as opposed to sort of evidence-based policy. But so as you can see, anyone can sort of explore all of the different issues that come up in the context of thinking about how should we design legislation, what can be done legislatively, what has to be done in other ways. The way that we talk about this is talking about this, and I think the Green New Deal fits it very well, as an example of climate chess, in the sense that you've got team urgency, you've got team no urgency. They've all got lots of pieces on the board. The pieces have different powers, different ways they can move, different levels of power, and we've organized in the climate web sort of the whole idea of how do you take a strategic / tactical chess-like approach to thinking about the Green New Deal and climate change, as opposed to simply saying we need cap and trade, or we need a 2-degree scenario, or we simply need to solve climate change. And obviously solving climate change is only going to happen if 3 or 4 other 100 things happen. And that's what we're trying to make it possible to explore in the climate web. I'll throw one last thing out because it might be of interest both to you and to students. My personal view, working in this space and teaching in this space for a long time, is that the whole idea of knowledge management is one of the skills that is simply not communicated and is not taught to students, whether in high school, whether in college. I personally think it's one of the biggest gaps that people come out of college with, is not really having any sense of how to think about knowledge management tools and how to use them to their professional benefit. Woodrow Wilson said that there's no idea in our heads that hasn't been worn shiny by someone else's brain. And that's just a great indication of why we need knowledge management in today's world. And I just want to point to a resource because what we've done is we've actually built a starter brain. This isn't the Climate Web, this is a derivative product, but anyone, if you go to starterbrain.theclimateweb.org, you will see this starter brain. Anyone can download this starter brain for free, and it has thousands of things in it in terms of dates and library and blogs and podcasts, and there's tons of stuff in here. And students can download this, they can download the brain software for free, and they can start building their own climate change knowledge management system, or any knowledge management system for that matter. So this is a resource that people might be interested in at starterbrain.theclimateweb.org. And you can see everything that I've been showing, you can see at theclimateweb.org, and you can go to the Green New Deal index entry, and this is what it'll look like online, and it's open access. So let me stop there.
Mark, let me say that there was no reason to stop there. In fact, I would like you to go back and talk about some of the things that were shown during Jeremy's remarks, just to further clarify and elaborate. We do not end at the top of the hour. We usually go until 15, 20 minutes after the hour. So if you were worried I wasn't moving urgently enough with my remarks, that's why. We still have plenty of time to take questions and for you, Mark, and Jeremy to further elaborate. I will respect both of your time when you guys need to sign off, but there is one question from Gina. How would you speak to green energy incentives in the Green New Deal? How do we get utilities to bring green energy into the grid? Jeremy, you want to take a shot at that, or Mark, either or both?
No, I mean, no, I'll let Jeremy take a first shot.
So I think that utilities are, and Ira, do you mind going on mute? So I think utilities are the place where there's most likely to be traction alongside electric vehicles. I'm sorry, I'm going to go off this headset. I'm getting a lot of echo. Sorry about that. So anyway, yeah. So the EVs are going to be number one on Schumer's list, but I think the grid stuff actually has the most interest from the rest of Congress who've been working on this a long time. I think the smart grid in particular is a place where they're ready to put money as part of an infrastructure deal. And, you know, there continues to be, both at the state level and federal level, talk about, you know, whether there should be a clean energy standard with a carbon-based standard to try to create incentives for private capital to flow in. So I think that's an area where the the Climate Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House are particularly starting to take a look, at least on the policy side on the federal level, and where we've seen the most progress so far on the state level.
Thanks, Jeremy. Mark, any further thoughts on that point?
No.
Very good. Mark, would you like to go back and just do a quick recap of the kinds of things that you showed on the video for the benefit of those who may be listening in later?
Well, you mean in terms of sort of the Green New Deal materials, or what are you thinking of specifically?
Yeah, just the kinds of things that you were showing in the background during Jeremy's remarks.
Right. Okay. Well, I basically, since there are literally dozens of things that relate to sort of what happens with the Green New Deal, what should happen, what should it be composed of, what are its targets, what are its goals, and so I was just clicking around in terms of, you know, the entire literature around business. There's a huge conversation, and it's a very interesting conversation, as to, you know, what will the role of business be in pushing climate policy, or alternatively, what is the role of business? And obviously there is no such thing as monolithic business, but what is the role of business in actually opposing climate policy? And there's a large conversation going on just that topic. And what can business do? There's a lot of academic work suggesting that business just cannot be expected to get into the role of really pushing for public policy on a topic like climate change, that even if they want to, they'll ultimately co-opt it. And so there's a whole academic literature out there on that exact topic. But then you get into alternative economic models. How does the circular economy, how does degrowth, how do all these alternative economics potentially fit into the Green New Deal? And there's a whole debate over the alternative political models. Is the Green New Deal, does it build on capitalism? Is it getting rid of capitalism? Is it challenging capitalism? And you can go in and explore sort of any of those topics. And so, as you can see here, I just listed, there are 3,000 index entries in the Climate Web, and there are about 25 or 30 of them listed here as being associated with the Green New Deal. But you literally can jump out of your silo and go and look at all of the other silos that are potentially involved here, and see which of those silos might be interesting to look at. And you can look at reports and news sources, videos, websites. As Ira said at the beginning, we've spent 20,000 hours pulling together stuff for years. And so we still come across interesting things every day that we link into the Climate Web. And so it's a massive resource for teaching and for other purposes.
Thank you, Mark.
This is really impressive. Ira, can I?
Go ahead.
When you have a moment, I want to speak to something you raised earlier on a different topic.
Yeah, I will turn it back to you in a second. Just building on Mark's mention of all the great references and resources on Climate Web. I did put in the chat box for this webinar a number of links. Most of those links are from the resource guide, the quick and dirty resource guide that Jeremy and I and Alan Horowitz provided to Congressional staff who were interested in how the Green New Deal proposal links with the broader sustainability dialogue. And while on this webinar, we've talked a bit about the links to environmental policy agenda and climate policy, I will just briefly say that the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium is doing this webinar about the Green New Deal because of those links to this broader sustainability dialogue. And in a nutshell, I will just say as we begin to wrap up, and then I will give it back to Jeremy for some final thoughts. The Green New Deal has opened the door to a renewed dialogue on sustainability. How we frame the conversation is critical. The Green New Deal, as Jeremy explained, has both traction and serious obstacles to its success. But let's be clear, the conversation is not new. The sustainability conversation must be realistically re-energized using the opportunity presented by the Green New Deal resolution. Climate change, of course, is the focus for many of us, but the agenda, the sustainability agenda, is much broader, and there's no reason to ignore all the useful building blocks from the United States and from around the world on broader sustainability agendas. And for me to sum up, as I have often said, climate change is not an environmental issue. It's the quintessential sustainability issue of our time, with environmental, economic, and social justice components as the basic definition of sustainability. So my own strongly held opinion is that, properly understood, sustainability is the coherent framework for advancing the bundle of issues contained in the Green New Deal resolution. That is basically the point of the op-ed that I've shared with all of you from the Hill. And hopefully this will all open the door to further discussion, not just in academia, but also in the policy and legislative context. What does sustainability mean in the U.S. market going forward? And so, Jeremy, I turn it back to you for your concluding thoughts.
Well said. And Mark, just want to say how impressive this Climate Web is. I'm glad I was able to get a dual benefit out of being on here, seeing some of that. Hey, I want to fix an important, I think, omission from my remarks, and Ira, you clued in on it, and so I just want to expand on it. That's the role of Jay Inslee and what's happened on the campaign trail. So Jay has actually, his team and him did a large amount of work trying to bridge the constituencies that I've talked about, from environmental groups to the Sunrise activists and other Green New Deal early supporters to unions, climate justice communities. And it is, now that he is out of the race, I think that a number of candidates have picked up his extensive climate platform and key components of it that get into more details on things like what, Gina Ray's done, what could be done, at least on the government side, getting utilities to open up green energy. And I don't think the slate of ideas is done there, but I do want to say, I think unforeseen at the time, I think when the Green New Deal is figuring out where to go next, I don't think the Green New Deal backers would say their job's done because Inslee did it by any means. But I do think that he sort of took the ball and ran with it the next step by putting more detail out there and getting very good reviews and buy-in from a lot of folks. So in addition to looking at how the candidates that are still in it have picked up parts of this platform and have their own platform, I would look back at, his announcements and the documents that they put out on his overall climate platform as keys to how the folks, leaders in the climate movement are starting, and on the policy side, are starting to look at how to implement some of this stuff. Because I think that's a handy guide.
Thank you, Jeremy. Before we sign off, there are a couple of additional posts in the chat box that I wanted to raise. First of all, just in terms of process, I already mentioned that the webinar recording will be posted on the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium website. There's also a question about the list of materials posted in the chat box for those who were not quick enough to write them down or copy them. If anybody wants a copy of the chat box materials, please just send me an email and I'll send that back to you. And finally, I think an appropriate place to end would be to ask both Mark and Jeremy to react to Anton Camerata's post in the chat box, which was, how do the Green New Deal policies deal with the fact that people are basically comfortable with their oil-based lives and products? People are afraid of the depth and scope of changes proposed by the Green New Deal, and that the risks posed by climate change are not well understood by the masses. Anton suggests that this combination of 3 points represents a significant social roadblock. And so, Mark, if you have some thoughts on that, and then Jeremy, and then we will wrap up.
Sure, and this, I personally see climate change really as a communications problem. Communicating with ourselves, communicating with audiences, communicating with quote unquote the opposition, it's very hard, and there is a massive cognitive psychology element to the climate communications issue. Willful blindness is rampant, and we are extremely comfortable with our oil-based lives, and we have every reason to be. I mean, in the sense that it's brought us an awfully long way. One of the real one of the quotes that I like most in this is that our risk brains are still looking for lions in the Serengeti. And in fact, yes, actually, there's a little image of this that I can call up. So, our risk brains have simply not really been able to adapt to a problem like climate change. And there is a very real chance that the cognitive biases that the questioner is talking about and the psychological barriers simply won't allow us to tackle this problem, and we'll slow it down enough so that we just don't make nearly as much progress as we need to. It's a huge issue, and it's a massive topic of the climate web.
Thanks, Mark. Jeremy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate, Mark, your thoughts on that. I'd add, I think this is also a clash of the science of communications that you were talking about, Mark, and the science of social movements. I'm more of a practitioner of the communication side, and agree with you, and that's why I very much believe that the thing that Inslee weaves through all parts of his plan is the drive for economic opportunity and to grow our way out of this problem. And I think that's true, and I think it's the right way to think about it. But I think that us practitioners also have to realize that pursuing the careful arts haven't gotten us very far over the years, and there is also a different kind of science of movements, and maybe it's not a science, but there's a history of movements, and those demonstrate that a strongly committed and relatively small compared to the total population share of the public, that are willing to go all out because they're so vested in the outcome, can make a big difference. And with the Green New Deal, we've seen that kind of energy and intensity that we haven't seen before. So the trick for moving forward is to figure out how to get the best of both worlds, not the worst of both worlds. That is that intensity and energy from the core, from the core boots on the ground, without turning off the rest of the public. And that's why Mitch McConnell jumped on this, is because he saw one at the expense of the other. And, clearly unforced errors like that FAQ that had some sloppy stuff in it, frankly, really can hurt on that. But I think the fundamentals of the Green New Deal, the idea of a 10-year mobilization economically behind this problem, is a way to go at this that people can understand and people can support. But it's a good question. I think if it wasn't a hard issue or a hard question, we would have solved it long before now. But my only hope moving forward in this, and what I believe, is that people are going to realize change is needed. It's the question of how quickly we get there. And so with that, I think if you look at just simply how do we make this most effective that we can right now.
Thank you for those thoughts, gentlemen, and I hope that the attendees have found this webinar to be helpful to them in conveying the Green New Deal proposal and sustainability linkages to their students. Our students are the future leaders who are going to need to implement all this stuff, and so the better job we as faculty can do in conveying an appropriate and accurate message of what this debate is all about, I think is critical. My thanks again to both of you for sharing your experience and insights. Everyone, please go to check out the Climate Web. Mark and his team have just an incredible job doing that, an amazing resource. And thanks to everyone for bearing with the GoToMeeting technical issues today. I think it ended up going rather well at the end of the day. And so at the end of the day, I say signing off, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Ira.
Thank you, Ira.